Hi, Dr. B for CRPC, here bringing you what we call an addendum to our series that we just completed on covenant baptism. Now, we realized going into this that there was no possible way that we could cover all the material on covenant baptism and the mode of baptism and the means of baptism, the meaning of baptism in the short period of time that we had. Instead, we decided to take one particular approach, was to examine the basic premises or presuppositions that people bring to bear on this particular topic, and then see if we could offer a reasonable defense of why we covenant Baptists do what we do. However, there are a number of things that we touched on in the lectures that I thought deserved a little bit more development than we could give it at the time. And so these addendums here are to answer questions or issues that came up sometimes off camera, or maybe to give a better understanding of some of the Greek, as the case may be, in order to give a fuller, richer understanding of why we happen to defend the faith that we do the way that we do. And this first one, I've called it, this is on, guys, I'm going to scare you with the topic. It's called epistemology. And the idea of how do we know what we know? And how are we convinced that what we know is true? Or to put it another way, maybe it's time to burn the heretic pastor at the stake, because I'm going to be offering some pretty radical ideas here, which I'm certain that a lot of my covenant brethren and Presbyterian brothers are really going to have some heartburn with. But I offer it because I think that my brothers they're great men, and they're smarter than me, they're wiser than me, they have a better education than I do, and I need to put my cards on the table right here at the front and admit kind of a shameful secret. You see, my doctorate is in sociology. Yeah, I know. All social science majors should be considered guilty until proven innocent, and I accept that. I acknowledge that. But when I was picking out some sort of work to do on the doctoral level, I knew I didn't want to make it theology, because if I went to a secular institution, I studied theology, there would be liberalism and orthodoxy and all the modern junk that goes with it. And there's no way I was ever going to get through a doctoral program studying theology. Same rules apply to, say, New Testament and Old Testament. Because if I did Old Testament, I'd be having to fight through the documentary hypothesis, which is a completely bankrupt system, but is still taught in major schools and universities and religious departments, and even by evangelical ones sometimes. And New Testament, it's all that form and redaction, criticism, the Jesus seminar people, all that kind of crazy stuff. So I thought I was going to be clever. I thought what I would do is that I would pick a subject matter on which evangelicals don't usually write much on. They're not really interested in. And therefore, when I got into the university system and I started doing my study and my research, I thought I could get away with something. And because it was social sciences, I could put it safely back in history somewhere and do a sociological analysis of the beliefs of the Puritans and why they built the kind of culture that they did. Yeah, it didn't quite work that well. So rather than going to a second-rate university and getting my doctorate, I kind of went to a third or fourth rate in order to finish up, because they were smarter than I thought they were and they caught me out. But at the same time, the social sciences, although for the most part they are bankrupt, for the most part, there's a lot of ungodly, unbiblical presuppositions that float within it. The reality is, when you come to think of it, is that sometimes there is some actually good research that's been done, especially on things that actually can be tested, such as the psychology of learning. And that emphasis on the psychology of learning has some direct implications on how we look at the faith and why we look at the differences that we have between various Christians. Though we touched on some of these issues in the lectures, I think if we really want to understand why there's such a big divide between Christ-affirming, Bible-believing, born-again believers on the issues such as baptism, you got to take a step back and think about how people arrive at their beliefs in the first place. And I think that's kind of helpful when we understood from a biblical perspective. It's helpful to understand why this division continues to separate us and has done so for the past, roughly 500 years. First of all, we need to look at a couple of things here, and these are just terminology things, but stay with me if you will. I promise it will get kind of interesting later on. But right now, understand this. There's a difference between credibility, what we find to be believable, and truth, what actually is real. Now, if you think about it just for a second there's a couple of things that come into play here. When we say something is credible, what are we saying? Really, honestly, we mean we find it plausible. We find it believable. In other words, it fits within our pre-existing thought forms. It fits within our presuppositions. It kind of fits within how we already think we know the world operates. And therefore, credibility is not really a criterion for truth. It's really a criterion for sociology. It has to do with the culture that we grow up in, the people that we hang out with. For example, I think everyone's already heard or seen this in a movie or something like that about the idea of primitive tribes, and someone would come and take a picture of them in the old days when they had, Kodak Instamatic cameras before they had digital cameras, and the natives would be shocked and they would be upset and angry because they thought that the people were taking their souls, capturing their souls on camera. And we laugh at that. We think that's incredible, that's stupid, that's ridiculous, that's outrageous. But from their perspective, they had never encountered this phenomenon before. They'd never seen, photographic images of themselves. And so they basically thought that this was their soul that was being captured. It was very credible from their perspective. Now, think with me just for a minute on this. Christians, we like to think of ourselves as the educated ones, the civilized ones, the ones who are products of 2,000 years of Christian civilization. But in reality, we're probably more like that primitive tribesman than we sometimes would like to admit. In fact, we have a particular worldview. We have a particular set of paradigms in place that help us to interpret the worldview. And I stand behind that paradigm 100%. I believe it is the correct paradigm. But also there are things that the outside world today, who no longer shares our beliefs or our presuppositions, they think that what we believe is incredible. Not because they've disproved it, not because they've come up with an understanding that's superior to ours, but rather because they accept different presuppositions. Now that's fact number one. Think that and keep that in the back of your mind. Number two, never underestimate the power of what's called conformity behavior. Well, conformity behavior is the tendency that we all have to adjust our beliefs, our values, and even our morals according to what we think the group norms are. And this is very well documented in study of psychology. There's a very famous experiment. Every first-year undergraduate student taking Introduction to Psychology comes across this particular case study, where basically the professor lines up a bunch of people in a room, and he puts two pictures of a line, and one is very obviously longer than the other. And then he talks about there being an optical illusion right there. And then what the kids don't, well, I should say, the actual subject is only one person in a group of, say, 10 or 12 people. All the other people in the room are stooges. They are actually, compatriots of the professors doing the research. And they make sure that they take the actual subject and they put him at the end of the row. And then what they do is they ask each person in line which line is longer, A or B. Well, everyone can see that A is obviously longer. But because they're all in on the experiment, they'll say B, 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 all the way down to the last person in the line. And guess what he does? He goes, look, it's obvious that it's A, but everyone else sees B. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I don't understand something. Or maybe I just don't want to stand out in this crowd. So he'll go along with B as well. Now, if you think that's just a little bit of, psychobabble here, think about this. The Apostle Paul said it this way in 1 Corinthians 15. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. He also says in 1 Corinthians 11:1, follow me as I follow Christ. In other words, 2,000 years before anyone had ever thought of this crazy experiment in conformity behavior, the Apostle Paul realized something that we all know from our experience, that people tend to change their beliefs depending upon what they think the group wants. And so as a consequence, basically, social belief, social pressure facilitates change. Every parent understands the danger of peer pressure. And they think it's people ganging up on their kids and forcing them and saying, oh, you're not cool if you don't do this. No, the reality is simply being in a group of people, and the adults themselves are exactly susceptible to it, will tend to give them a certain perception of what morality is, what is normal. And a lot of people, all of us, are subject to this particular temptation. Now, these two dynamics really, really, really affect how we approach Scripture. And I think this is kind of an area where my brothers who are much better educated than I am, they're smarter than I am. They're fluent in Greek and Hebrew, and I just managed to pass the necessary courses I needed in seminary in order to become a pastor. But basically what happens is that because they have this particular orientation, they don't always understand how they arrived at the beliefs that they arrived at. And it's not always a simple matter of reason and logic and clear deductive thinking. Look, let's be honest. I'm Reformed. I'm a Calvinist, as some people say. I believe in the total depravity of man. I believe that not that man is totally evil, but that man is affected by sin in the totality of his being. Every aspect of his being is affected by sin. That means his body is affected by sin. It grows old, it grows weak, it grows sick, it dies, it's susceptible to temptations, fleshly lusts of various types. I believe that my will is affected by sin. I sometimes want to do things that are contrary to God's law and goodness and glory. But I also think that my mind is affected by sin. Paul says this in Romans 3, 1 and following. There is none righteous, no, not even one. And then he goes down through a whole long list of how people's minds are depraved. He actually goes into greater detail in Romans chapter 1, verse 18 and 20, where he talks about men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, that God gives them over as fools. He makes them fools, and they believe foolish things. But I also think that this principle also applies to us. It applies to the way that we think. And sometimes good arguments are dismissed or ignored or devalued or suppressed, and bad arguments take their place because, one, we want to fit in. We want to believe what, and that's not something that we have in our brains. It's not, there's a big, red sign, with a little horned figure in the background going, hey, believe what everyone else says. No, it's a little bit more basic than that. It's essentially this, is that we have this natural tendency to want to be approved and accepted by those around us. And so when they believe something different than what we believe, whether we know it or not, we tend to change our opinion to reflect the majority. In fact, one of the very famous studies I ended up looking at when I was doing my doctoral work in the sociology of religion had to do with the secularization of American culture. And that is, how did people go from a religious worldview in the 17th and 18th and 19th century to a secular worldview in the late 19th and 20th century? And that's just how old the doctoral research was, because it was still the 20th century when I was doing the research. And scientists had been studying this for years. Various different groups and various different scholars in various different places were doing the surveys and doing the things that sociologists do and trying to figure out why people went from believing in religious views, because almost always, like 60, 70, 80 years ago, the vast majority of people in America grew up in religious homes. That's not true today, but it was then. And then they found that by about the age of 25, a significant amount of these people, around 75%, according to some studies, basically abandoned a religious worldview. And when they did studies, is to say, well, why did you actually leave this worldview? Why did you abandon religion? And they thought it's because they went to college and they were smart and they learned Darwinism and they learned, all this kind of stuff, and that these intellectual ideas overcame the earlier primitive, stupid, prejudiced, ignorant religious beliefs. And what they found was kind of surprising. It was very rare, they discovered, for a person to actually sit down and take the two worldviews, a religious worldview or, a secular worldview, and weigh the pros and cons of each side, and then calmly and quietly and rationally arrive at a decision that this worldview is more coherent, more consistent, it fits my life's needs better, etc. All the reasons why you would think someone might switch worldviews. Instead, what they found was that basically people found themselves in social situations where religious worldview was simply not appropriate anymore. They started hanging out with people who didn't believe what they believed, people whose good opinion they wanted, jobs that they wanted to progress in, girls that they wanted to date, or boys they wanted to marry, or whatever. And so bit by bit, they ended up abandoning a Christian worldview for a secular one.